The silence on the 42nd floor wasn't empty. It was heavy, waiting. At 8:14 p.m., the blue light of my monitor cut through the dark, signaling the notification I'd been dreading and craving in equal measure. Subject, strategy alignment. Location, director's office. Now. My heart hammered a rhythm against my ribs that had nothing to do with quarterly projections. I stood, my heels sounding too loud on the plush carpet, walking toward the glass-walled office at the end of the hall. She was inside, silhouetted against the city lights, a study in stillness. I pushed the heavy glass door open, and the air immediately changed. Charged, electric, dangerous. The door clicked shut behind me, sealing us in. To understand the weight of that silence, you have to understand Ashley Sweeney. She didn't just join the firm, she descended upon it like a weather system. She was architectural elegance wrapped in terrifying competence. When she walked into a room, the air pressure dropped. Her suits were sharp enough to cut glass, always monochrome, always perfect, signaling a level of control I couldn't fathom. I was a junior strategist, a title that mostly meant I was invisible, part of the furniture, there to ensure the slide decks were formatted correctly and the water bottles were full. But with Ashley, invisibility wasn't an option. From her first week, I watched her dismantle senior partners with a softness that was more devastating than shouting. She would sit at the head of the mahogany table, her posture perfect, and ask a single, quiet question that unraveled weeks of their lazy logic. It was terrifying. It was intoxicating. I sat in the back row of those meetings, clutching my notebook, trying to make myself smaller. But I felt it, the pull. It wasn't just admiration for her mind, though that was part of it. It was the way the air thickened whenever she moved near my side of the room, the scent of expensive sandalwood and cold rain that trailed her. The subtle recognition happened on a Tuesday. We were reviewing the Q3 acquisition targets. The room smelled of stale coffee and high-stakes anxiety. The VP of sales was droning on about synergy. Ashley was bored. I could tell by the way her fingers tapped a silent, restless rhythm against the polished wood of the table. Then she looked up. Her gaze bypassed the VP, bypassed the creative director, and landed directly on me in the back corner. It wasn't a casual glance. It was an anchor. For 3 seconds, an eternity in a boardroom, she held my eyes. Her expression was unreadable, unflinching, but the connection was physical, a sudden heat that flushed my skin. She didn't smile. She just saw me. Then she looked back at the VP and said, "The data doesn't support that assumption." The room scrambled to catch up to her pivot, but I was frozen, my skin prickling. That look became a secret language, a shared frequency only we were tuned into. I told myself it was professional scrutiny. I told myself I was projecting, that I was just another ambitious junior desperate for mentorship. But ambition doesn't make your breath hitch when a woman walks past your desk. Ambition doesn't make you memorize the specific cadence of someone's footsteps, or the way light catches the silver pen she twists between her fingers. I was terrified of her authority, yes, but I was more terrified of the way my body betrayed me whenever she was close. I tried to focus on the work. I stayed late to perfect models I knew she would review. I wanted her approval. I wanted her to look at my work with that same laser focus she applied to everything else. But deep down, beneath the layers of professional decorum and corporate strategy, I knew I was playing a dangerous game. I wasn't staying late for the bonus. I was staying late because the office felt empty without her presence anchoring it. I was waiting for the moment the professional distance would crack, just a hairline fracture, enough to let the light in. Then came the first deviation. The standard rhythm of the firm was rigid. 9 to 5 for the assistants, 9 to 7 for the associates, 9 to whenever for the partners. But that email changed the timeline. It wasn't a calendar invite sent by an assistant 2 days in advance. It was a direct summons, sent after the cleaning crew had already emptied the trash bins. It was a breach of protocol. It was an invitation. And as I stood outside her office door that night, watching her trace a line on a document with a fountain pen, I knew the strategy we were about to align had nothing to do with business. "Close the door," she said, without looking up from the document in front of her. Her voice was low, a velvet texture that seemed to vibrate against the glass walls, absorbing the ambient hum of the building's HVAC system. I pushed the heavy glass until it clicked into the magnetic lock. The sound was final, sealing out the cleaning crews and the empty cubicles. Inside, the atmosphere was entirely different. Ashley had killed the overhead fluorescents, leaving the room bathed in the warm amber glow of a single brass desk lamp and the sprawling, glittering nervous system of the city skyline behind her floor-to-ceiling windows. It felt less like an executive office and more like a cockpit, or perhaps a confession booth. Q4 projections, she murmured, finally lifting her eyes. She took off her glasses, tortoiseshell, severe, and set them on the leather blotter with a deliberate click. The board is restless about the acquisition targets. I need a second pair of eyes on the growth vectors. I nodded, my throat suddenly dry. Of course. I can pull the files up on the main screen. I gestured toward the large monitor mounted on the wall, the standard procedure for collaborative work. No, she said. She gestured to the space beside her. Here, look at the raw data with me. She stood up, not to greet me, but to move a chair. It was a heavy, high-backed, leather executive chair, identical to hers. She rolled it around the corner of the massive oak desk, positioning it right next to her own. The invitation was silent, but it screamed. She wasn't asking me to sit across from her, separated by the barrier of authority and wood. She was asking me to breach the perimeter. Walking around that desk felt like crossing a heavily guarded border. I sat down. The distance between us evaporated instantly. In the boardroom, Ashley was a distant monolith, a figure of sharp lines and colder logic. Here, she was terrifyingly real. I could see the fine grain of her skin, the faint shadow of exhaustion beneath her eyes that the harsh boardroom lighting usually washed out, and the smell. It hit me then, a wave of her signature scent. It was complex, grounded in sandalwood and something sharper, like expensive parchment or rain on pavement. It wasn't a perfume meant to seduce. It was a scent meant to linger. This margin here, she said, leaning in to wake up her monitor. Her arm brushed against mine. It was just a graze, a whisper of her silk blouse against the rougher cotton of my blazer. But my nerves fired as if I'd touched a live wire. The heat radiating from her was startling. She didn't pull away. She didn't apologize. She didn't acknowledge it at all. She just started scrolling through the spreadsheet, her movements precise and fluid. It's ambitious, she continued, her voice dropping an octave, intimate and hushed. Do you think we can hold it? I forced my brain to process the numbers, fighting the fog that the proximity was creating in my head. If the market stabilizes in November, and if the retention rates hold, and if they don't? She turned her head. We were so close that when she turned, I could feel the ghost of her breath against my cheek. I looked at her, really looked at her, and realized she wasn't looking at the screen. She was watching my profile, her gaze tracing the line of my jaw. Then we pivot, I managed to say, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears, shaky and thin. We adjust the spend. Precision, she whispered. It was a word she used constantly in meetings, a weapon she used to bludgeon lazy thinking. Here, in the dark, it sounded like a caress. I like how you think. You see the structure of things, not just the noise. The silence returned, but it wasn't empty. It was thick, heavy with the hum of the computer and the sound of our breathing. We spent the next 40 minutes dissecting rows and columns, but the data was just a backdrop. The real conversation was happening in the pauses. It was in the way she would wait a beat too long to scroll to the next page, keeping our shoulders pressed together. It was in the way she asked for my opinion on high-level strategy that a junior associate had no business weighing in on. She wasn't treating me like a subordinate. She was treating me like a conspirator. You're tense, she observed quietly, after I fumbled an answer about customer acquisition costs. I'm just focused, I lied. Relax. She shifted, turning her chair fully toward me. Her knee knocked against mine under the desk. A sharp intake of breath. Mine. She held my gaze, her eyes dark and unreadable in the low light. We're just aligning the strategy. There's nothing to be afraid of. By the time we finished, it was past 9:30. As I walked back to my desk to pack up, the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a jarring clarity. The urgent review turned out to be minor adjustments that could have been an email sent at 9 a.m. the next morning. The crisis was a fabrication, a construct.
She knew it was unnecessary. She knew I knew. And she had asked me to stay anyway. I stood in the elevator watching the numbers descend, knowing I was already in free fall. It didn't take long for the exception to become the rule. By the third week, it was no longer a surprise. It was a ritual. Thursday nights became a sacred, secret geography on my calendar. The notification would ping, strategy alignment, and my pulse would jump, a Pavlovian response to the promise of proximity. The rest of the firm would empty out, the elevators swallowing waves of analysts and partners until the 42nd floor was a ghost town of silent phones and dark monitors. But in the corner office, the ecosystem was just waking up. The transformation was always the same, a slow shedding of the corporate skin. First, the lighting. Ashley would walk to the dimmer switch and kill the harsh, sterile overheads. The room would plunge into shadow, relieved only by the golden pool of the desk lamp and the glittering, indifferent city grid outside. It felt like we were underwater, cut off from the surface world, navigating deep currents where the normal rules of engagement didn't apply. Then the armor came off. This was the part that made my mouth dry. During the day, Ashley was buttoned up, encased in sharp tailoring that screamed authority. But on Thursday nights, the blazer was draped over the back of her chair. She would roll her shoulders, a small, human movement that made her seem suddenly accessible. The most devastating sound in the world became the soft, heavy thud of her heels dropping onto the carpet under the desk. It was a sound of surrender. It signaled that she wasn't going anywhere, and neither was I. Seeing her in stocking feet, curling her toes into the plush rug, felt like seeing a secret vulnerability she saved only for me. I lived for it. My entire week compressed into the anticipation of those hours. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, they were just obstacles to be cleared. I found myself choosing my outfits on Thursday mornings with a desperate care, wondering if she would notice the silk of a blouse or the cut of a skirt. I was a professional strategist, a woman who prided herself on logic, yet I was reduced to a bundle of raw nerves by the mere possibility of her attention. The work became a pretext. We still had the spreadsheets up, the decks open, but the boundaries were eroding, washed away by the tide of late-night intimacy. We started ordering dinner in, a domestic act performed in a space designed for commerce. We moved from the desk to the leather sofa in the corner, balancing cartons of takeout on our knees, the air thick with the scent of basil and the hum of the rain against the glass. There was one night in mid-November that shifted the axis permanently. We were sharing Thai food, sitting close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from her arm. I reached for the container of extra lime at the exact moment she did. Our hands collided. It wasn't a polite bump. It was a tangle. My fingers brushed the back of her hand, and the contact sent a jolt through me that was sharper than pain. I froze. A normal colleague would pull away, apologize, laugh it off. Ashley didn't move. Her hand remained under mine, warm and steady. She looked up, her fork suspended, her eyes locking onto mine with that terrifying, unflinching intensity. "Sorry," I breathed, my voice barely audible. "Don't," she said. Her voice was low, devoid of the sharp professional cadence she used in the boardroom. "Never apologize for taking what you need." She wasn't talking about the lime. We both knew it. She slowly withdrew her hand, but her gaze lingered on my face, tracing the flush I knew was rising on my neck. The air between us thickened, charged with a heavy, static tension that made it hard to breathe. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of things we weren't saying. She set her food down, the appetite for dinner gone. She leaned back into the sofa, tucking one leg beneath her. A casual, unguarded posture that made my heart ache. "Forget the Q4 metrics," she said softly, watching me. "Tell me about you. Not the strategist. You. What keeps you awake when you're not worrying about my margins?" The question hung in the air between us, suspended in the amber light of the desk lamp like a pendulum waiting to swing. What keeps you awake? It was a trap, of course. A beautiful, dangerous trap. We were supposed to be discussing acquisition targets and growth vectors, not the architecture of my insomnia.
I instinctively tried to retreat into the safety of the corporate script. I opened my mouth to give the polished, interview-ready answer. Something about my drive for excellence, or my restless ambition to optimize the client portfolio. I think about the market volatility, I started, my voice sounding tinny and fake even to my own ears. I worry that we're missing the window on the tech merger. Ashley didn't blink. She didn't even smile. She just tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing with a look that was equal parts disappointment and challenge. "Don't," she said softly. "Don't give me the brochure. Not here, not in the dark." That was the moment the wall crumbled. The professional facade I had spent 3 years constructing, the armor of blazers and buzzwords, felt suddenly paper thin. She wasn't asking the junior strategist. She was asking the woman who was sitting on her sofa at 9 p.m., eating cold pad thai and trembling slightly from a brush of fingers. "I worry that I'm just noise," I admitted, the truth slipping out before I could catch it. The words felt raw, stripped of their usual polish. "I worry that I'm spending my life moving pieces around a board that doesn't actually matter, that I'm invisible in a city of millions, just another suit in a glass tower." The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't judgmental. It was receptive. Ashley shifted, the leather of the sofa creaking beneath her. She turned fully toward me, abandoning the rigid posture of the director. In the dim light, she looked less like a monument and more like a person. "You're not invisible," she said. Her voice was low, a velvet texture that seemed to wrap around my spine. "You are the only thing in this building that feels real to me right now." My breath hitched. The admission was startling in its directness. Then she did something that terrified me more than her criticism ever had. She leaned her head back against the cushions and closed her eyes. For a moment, the terrifying competence vanished. The architectural elegance softened. She looked tired. Not the superficial fatigue of a missed coffee, but the deep, marrow-level exhaustion of someone who has to be the sharpest blade in the drawer for 14 hours a day. "Do you know what keeps me awake?" she asked, her eyes still closed, exposing the delicate, pale skin of her eyelids. "No," I whispered. "The silence," she murmured. "I spend all day talking, directing, dismantling arguments. I am surrounded by people who want something from me, who need me to be perfect. And then I go home to a glass box in the sky, and it is so quiet I can hear my own blood rushing in my ears. It's lonely at the altitude, isn't it?" She opened her eyes and looked at me. The vulnerability there was devastating. It was a crack in the marble. She was offering me a piece of her reality, the isolation that fueled the ambition. It was a weapon, and she was handing it to me hilt first. I looked at the softness around her eyes, tiny lines that the harsh fluorescent lights of the boardroom usually washed out. I saw the human woman who existed behind the title. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't mentorship. Mentors don't tell you they are lonely in the dark. Mentors don't look at your mouth when you speak with a hunger that has nothing to do with quarterly earnings. The atmosphere in the room thickened, becoming viscous and charged. The air felt heavy, electric, stripped of oxygen. We were sitting inches apart, the boundaries of our roles dissolving into the shadows. The city grid outside was a sprawling nervous system of light, indifferent to us, but in here, everything was hyper-focused. I could smell the sandalwood again, warmer now, mixed with the scent of rain that clung to the windows. "You're not alone right now," I said. The words felt heavy, significant, like a stone dropped into a deep well. "No," she murmured, her gaze dropping to my lips for a fraction of a second before snapping back to my eyes. The look was scorching. "I suppose I'm not." I realized then that the files on the desk were forgotten. The strategy was irrelevant. We were navigating a different kind of landscape now, one with no map and no safety net. It wasn't about the work anymore. It was about the slow, deliberate dismantling of the distance between us. And God help me, I didn't want to rebuild it. The stakes escalated in early December. The subject line was professional enough. Chicago merger, on-site due diligence. But the reality was a plane ticket and a lie. We didn't need to be in Chicago. The client was happy with a Zoom call. The data room was virtual. But Ashley had insisted that we needed boots on the ground, a phrase that sounded ridiculous coming from a woman who wore Italian stilettos. We flew first class. The physical proximity of the office was one thing, contained by glass walls and HR protocols, but travel was a lawless state. Sitting beside her in the wide leather seat at 30,000 feet, watching her sip sparkling water while reading a thick contract, I felt like we were in a capsule, hurtling away from reality. She fell asleep somewhere over Ohio, her head lolling slightly toward my shoulder. I spent an hour, terrified to move, memorizing the curve of her eyelashes, terrified she would wake up and catch me watching. The hotel was one of those places that smells of old money, white lilies, and discretion. My room was on the 14th floor. Hers was the suite at the end of the hall. I had barely unpacked my blazer, hanging it in the closet like a shield I wouldn't need, when the text came. Room 1402. Bring the deck. And the wine. I walked down the hallway, the thick floral carpet swallowing the sound of my footsteps. My heart was doing that traitorous hammering thing again, a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I told myself this was work. We had a pitch at 8 a.m. We needed to rehearse the synergy slide. We needed to align. But when she opened the door, the rehearsal excuse died in my throat. Ashley wasn't wearing the armor. The sharp, monochromatic suit that kept the world at bay was gone. In its place, she wore a silk camisole, the color of champagne, and loose, flowing trousers that looked like liquid slate. A cashmere cardigan hung off one shoulder, exposing the sharp, elegant line of her collarbone. It was the most casual I had ever seen her, and yet she looked more dangerous than ever. The softness made her accessible. It made her touchable. "Come in," she said, stepping back. Her voice was lower here, stripped of the boardroom echo. The suite was dimly lit, the heavy curtains drawn against the wind coming off the lake. A room service cart with an untouched cheese plate sat in the corner. I set my laptop on the mahogany coffee table, but neither of us made a move to open it. The black screen reflected our distorted silhouettes. "Pour," she commanded softly, gesturing to 2 crystal glasses she'd set out. I poured the wine, the dark red liquid swirling, my hands shaking slightly. She watched me. Her gaze wasn't dissecting a spreadsheet. It was dissecting me. She took the glass from my hand, her fingers brushing mine, a deliberate, lingering contact that sent a shockwave up my arm. She didn't pull back. "We should go over the slide on synergies," I stammered, desperate for a shield, staring at the pulse point in her neck. "The slides are fine," she dismissed, sinking onto the velvet sofa and patting the cushion beside her. "Sit." I sat. The air in the room was thick, pressurized, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. "You were brilliant in the prep call yesterday," she said, turning to face me. Her knee was inches from mine, the silk of her trousers shimmering. "You have a mind like a steel trap. You see patterns before they form. It's rare." "Thank you," I whispered, the praise dizzying. "It's not just the work," she continued, her voice dropping, becoming husky. She leaned in. The scent of her, sandalwood, vanilla, and warm skin, filled my senses, drowning out the hotel's sterile lily smell. "It's you. When you're in the room, the noise stops. You have this calming effect on me, like an anchor in a storm. I feel steady when you're near." She reached out. For a second, I thought she was going to kiss me. Her hand hovered near my face, her thumb ghosting over my cheekbone, close enough to feel the heat. I stopped breathing. The world narrowed down to the dark pull of her eyes. I wanted her to close the gap. I wanted to ruin my career right there on the velvet sofa. "Ashley," I breathed, a question and a plea. She froze. A flicker of hesitation, or maybe restraint, crossed her face. She pulled her hand back, picking up her wine instead. The moment shattered, but the shards were sharp. "Go to bed," she said abruptly, though her voice was strained, tight with something unsaid. "We have an early morning." I left the room, my body humming with unspent adrenaline. The door clicked shut behind me, but the electricity didn't fade. I lay in my own bed down the hall, staring at the ceiling, knowing that the merger was the least of my problems. We were colliding, and there would be no survivors. The crisis didn't knock. It kicked the door down on a Tuesday afternoon. It was the nightmare scenario, a massive data leak for our largest fintech client. The kind of catastrophe that tanks stock prices and ends careers before dinner. The news broke at 2 p.m. By 2:15 p.m., the 42nd floor was a scene of controlled panic. Partners were shouting into phones, legal teams were swarming like sharks scenting blood, and the air conditioning couldn't keep up with the collective sweat of the executive team. Ashley didn't shout. She went terrifyingly still. She stood in the center of the chaos, an island of ice in a sea of fire, and pointed at me. "You," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. "My office. Now." We didn't leave that glass box for 14 hours. The rest of the firm slowly peeled away, defeated or dismissed, until it was just the two of us against the collapse of a billion-dollar portfolio. This wasn't the slow, sensual burn of our Thursday nights. This was trench warfare. The office became a bunker. The pristine desk was buried under a blizzard of printed non-disclosure agreements, crisis communication drafts, and empty espresso cups. By midnight, the professional veneer had been stripped away completely. Ashley had discarded her blazer hours ago. Her silk blouse was unbuttoned at the collar, sleeves rolled up to her elbows, revealing forearms that looked deceptively delicate as she typed with violent precision. Her hair, usually an architectural marvel, was pulled back into a messy, desperate knot, with loose strands falling into her eyes. Seeing her like this, unpolished, frantic, raw, felt more intimate than seeing her naked. We were rewriting the narrative for the morning press release, fighting to salvage the client's reputation. The exhaustion was a physical weight, pressing down on our chests, stripping away the filters that usually kept us in check. "This paragraph is weak," she muttered, staring at the screen, her voice raspy from hours of talking. "It sounds defensive. We need to sound inevitable." "It's not defensive," I countered, the fatigue making me bold. "It's transparent. If we spin this too hard, they'll see the seams. We have to own the flaw to sell the fix." She stopped typing. The silence in the room was sudden and absolute. In the boardroom, contradicting Ashley Sweeney was a death sentence. Here, at 2 a.m., with the city asleep around us, it was a necessity. She turned her chair slowly to face me. Her eyes were rimmed with red, dark circles bruising the skin beneath them, but her gaze was sharp. She studied me for a long, heavy moment, dissecting my logic. "Show me," she said. I moved my chair closer until the armrests were locked together. I leaned over her shoulder to reach the keyboard, my body curving around hers to reach the mouse. The proximity was unavoidable, suffocating, and electric. My chest brushed against her shoulder. Her hair tickled my cheek. I could smell the stale coffee and the sharp tang of adrenaline. But underneath it all was that persistent, grounding scent of sandalwood and warm skin. We stayed like that for an hour, working on a single document as a two-headed organism. I would type a sentence, she would delete a word. She would suggest a pivot, I would refine the angle. The hierarchy dissolved. There was no director and junior strategist anymore. There were just two minds syncing perfectly in the dark, fueled by caffeine and the high-stakes terror of failure. "Here," she whispered, pointing to a line I'd just written. "That's it. That's the turn." She turned her head to look at me, forgetting how close we were. Her nose brushed against my jaw. We froze. The frantic clicking of the keyboard stopped. For a heartbeat, the crisis didn't exist. There was only the heat radiating from her body into mine, the sound of her shallow breathing, and the way her pupils dilated as she looked at my mouth. "I couldn't do this without you," she admitted, her voice so low it was almost a vibration against my skin. "Everyone else, they panic. You just sharpen." "We're a good team," I whispered back, the words feeling inadequate. "We're dangerous," she corrected. We held the gaze for a second too long, the air between us charged enough to spark a fire. Then the phone on her desk rang, the legal team in London. The spell broke. We pulled apart, breathless, and dove back into the war. When we finally hit send on the final package, the clock read 4:12 a.m. The crisis was contained, the stock would hold, we had won. The adrenaline that had sustained us for hours suddenly crashed, leaving us floating in a strange, exhausted euphoria. The silence returned to the office, but it was different now. It was the silence of survivors. We sat back in our chairs, surrounded by the wreckage of the night, and just breathed. The distance between us gone forever. The silence that rushed in to fill the void left by the crisis was different. It wasn't the heavy, waiting silence of 8 p.m. It was the raw, exposed silence of 4:15 a.m., a time that doesn't belong to the day or the night. It belongs to secrets. The city outside the floor-to-ceiling windows had finally given up the ghost. The traffic was gone, the office towers opposite us were dark monoliths, and the only light in the world seemed to be the blue glow of our monitors and the desk lamp that cast Ashley in soft, golden relief. The adrenaline, which had been a roaring river in my veins for 14 hours, drained away all at once. In its wake, it left a clarity that was sharp enough to cut. I looked at Ashley. The director was gone. The woman who remained was slumped in her leather chair, her head resting against the high back, her eyes closed. A loose strand of hair had escaped her bun and fell across her cheek. Her silk blouse was wrinkled at the elbows. She looked human. She looked devastating. I should have stood up. I should have packed my bag, called a car, and fled to the safety of my apartment. But gravity had shifted. The center of the room wasn't the door. It was the woman, breathing softly, 3 feet away from me. "We did it," I whispered, the words feeling inadequate, small things in the vastness of the room. Ashley opened her eyes. They were dark, dilated, stripping me bare. She didn't straighten up. She didn't put the armor back on. She turned her head slowly to look at me, her expression unreadable. "We did," she murmured. Her voice was a rasp, rough with exhaustion and something else, something lower, thicker. "I suppose this means you can go home now. The crisis is managed. The strategy is aligned." "I suppose so," I said. But I didn't move. "But you're not leaving," she observed. It wasn't a question. "No." She laughed, a low, dry sound that had no humor in it. She spun her chair slightly, closing the last few inches of distance between us until our knees were locked together, a bridge of bone and fabric. "Do you know," she began, looking down at her hands that I had watched dismantle careers, now resting open and vulnerable on her lap. "How many times I've rewritten the agenda for our Thursday nights just to keep you here?" My breath caught in my throat. We were saying the quiet part out loud. We were crossing the Rubicon. "Ashley, I invent them," she confessed, her eyes snapping up to meet mine, fierce and terrified. "The projection errors, the formatting issues, the need for a fresh perspective. It's all a lie. I'm the director of strategy, and I can't strategize my way out of this. I keep you here because when you leave, the air leaves the room with you. I keep you here because I'm starving, and you're the only thing that feeds me." The admission hit me like a physical weight. The fear, the deeply ingrained self-preservation instinct of a junior employee, screamed that this was dangerous. This was a line you didn't just cross, you detonated it. But the pull was stronger. The pull was a riptide. "I know," I whispered. The truth felt dangerous on my tongue. "I know they aren't real, and I stay anyway. I wait for the email. I wait for the excuse." The air between us crackled, stripped of oxygen. Ashley reached out. Her movement was slow, deliberate, giving me 1,000 years to pull away, to turn my head, to stop this. I stayed frozen. Her hand, cool and trembling slightly, touched my face. Her fingers brushed the hair back from my temple, tucking it behind my ear with a tenderness that shattered me. This was the test. A hand on a shoulder is camaraderie. A handshake is business. But fingers tracing the sensitive skin behind your ear, a thumb resting on the pulse point of your jaw, that is a claim. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a breath against my skin. Her eyes dropped to my mouth, hungry and unguarded. "Why do you stay?" I could feel the heat of her palm seeping into my skin, branding me. The last wall collapsed. There was no more junior strategist. There was no more director. There was just the undeniable magnetic force that had been pulling us together for months. "Because," I said, leaning into her touch, surrendering to the fall. "I'm not here for the strategy either." We didn't kiss that morning. The sunrise felt like an intrusion, a harsh spotlight we weren't ready to step into. We retreated to our separate corners, fleeing the scene of our emotional crime before the assistants arrived with their lattes and their curiosity. But the truce was temporary. We both knew it. The air between us had shifted permanently. The tension wasn't a hum anymore. It was a scream. The following evening, there was no email, no subject line, no pretext of a strategy deck or a crisis call. I simply waited until the floor emptied, until the cleaners had come and gone, and then I walked down the hall. My laptop stayed in my bag. My notebook stayed in my drawer. I wasn't going there to take notes. I pushed the glass door open. Ashley wasn't behind her desk. She was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the sprawling grid of the city, a silhouette cut from steel and shadow. She held a glass of red wine in one hand, her knuckles white against the crystal. The overheads were off. The only light came from the city below, painting the room in cool blues and distant ambers. "Lock it," she said. She didn't turn around. Her voice was steady, but it lacked the command voice of the director. It was just Ashley. I turned the thumb lock on the door. The click echoed like a gunshot in the silence. I walked across the plush carpet, the sound of my heels absorbed by the room. I stopped 3 feet behind her. I could smell her perfume, that sandalwood and rain scent, stronger now, or maybe my senses were just dialed up to a frequency that picked up nothing else. "There's no deck to review, Ashley," I said. My voice trembled, betraying the bravado I was trying to project. "There's no crisis. The client is happy. The numbers are solid." She turned slowly. The look on her face stopped my heart. The terrifying competence was gone. In its place was a raw, naked hunger that she made no attempt to hide. She set the wineglass down on the windowsill with a trembling hand. "I know," she whispered. "Then why are we here?" I asked. It was the final question. The last chance to back out, to claim this was mentorship, to claim we were just two exhausted professionals commiserating in the dark. "Because I am tired of pretending that I'm looking at the data when I am looking at you," she said. Her gaze dropped to my lips, heavy and possessive. "Because the strategy was never the point. You know that. You've known that since October." "I needed to hear you say it," I breathed. "I'm saying it," she replied, taking a step toward me. "I'm done strategizing." She closed the distance. The breach was total. There was no desk between us this time, no laptop screen, no safe harbor of professional conduct. She reached out, her hands framing my face, her thumbs tracing the line of my jaw with a reverence that felt like worship. Her skin was hot, burning through the cool air of the office. "Ashley," I gasped. But her name was swallowed by her mouth crashing onto mine. It wasn't a tentative first kiss. It wasn't a testing of waters. It was a collision. It was the breaking of a dam that had been holding back months of pressure. She kissed me with the same intensity she brought to the boardroom. Unflinching, demanding, absolute. But there was a softness there, too. A desperate, yielding softness that wrecked me. She tasted of oaky wine and fatigue and something uniquely her. Something electric. I made a sound, a low whimper in my throat, and gripped the lapels of her silk blouse, pulling her closer, trying to eliminate the friction of space. She groaned into my mouth, her hands tangling in my hair, destroying the professional blowout I'd carefully styled that morning. We stumbled back, blindly, until my back hit the cold glass of the window. The city was behind me, a million watching eyes, but I didn't care. "This," she whispered against my lips, breaking away for a fraction of a second to breathe, her forehead resting against mine. "This is a terrible idea." "The worst," I agreed, breathless, my hands sliding down to grip her waist. "Statistically unsound." "High risk," she murmured, biting her lower lip, her eyes dark and dilated. "Catastrophic failure potential," I countered. "I don't care," she growled, and kissed me again, deeper this time, possessing me completely. The office dissolved. The titles dissolved. There was no Director Sweeney and Junior Strategist. There was just the friction of silk against cotton, the heat of bodies pressing together in the dark, the frantic, messy unraveling of two women who had spent too long starving in sight of the feast. We moved with a frantic urgency, hands exploring, mapping the reality of bodies we had only imagined. When her hand slipped under my blazer, finding the warmth of my skin through my shirt, I felt a clarity sharper than any data set. This was the alignment we had been looking for. We didn't stop until the sky outside began to turn the bruised purple of pre-dawn. We collapsed onto the leather sofa, limbs tangled, breathless and undone, watching the sun threaten to rise on a world that had completely changed.
The morning light was unforgiving. It hit the glass walls at 6 a.m., turning the office into a prism of exposure that made no allowances for what we had done. We untangled ourselves with a reluctance that felt physical, like tearing skin. The reality of the situation didn't hit me until I was standing in the restroom down the hall, splashing cold water on my face, trying to make myself look like a junior strategist again. I stared at my reflection in the harsh fluorescent mirror. My blouse was hopelessly wrinkled, my lips were swollen and bitten. I looked like a woman who had just destroyed her career with a single night of recklessness. The panic set in then, cold, sharp, and rational. I had slept with the director. I had crossed the one line HR warns you about in the orientation videos. I gripped the porcelain sink, my knuckles white. What happens when the adrenaline fades? What happens when she puts the armor back on? I walked back to her office, expecting the ice. I expected the regret, the "this was a mistake" speech, the sudden re-erection of the professional walls to protect the firm's liability. But when I entered, Ashley was sitting on the edge of her desk, her heels back on, her hair pulled back into a severe, perfect ponytail. She looked composed, architectural again, except for her eyes. They were soft, unguarded, watching me cross the threshold. "Stop," she said, before I could speak. She stood and walked over to me, stopping just inside the threshold of personal space. "I can hear your brain spinning from here. You're calculating the risk. You're drafting the resignation letter in your head." "Ashley, the hierarchy," I started, my voice tight. "The protocols." "To hell with the protocols," she said quietly. She reached out, straightening my collar with a touch that was maddeningly possessive, her fingers lingering on the pulse of my throat. "This isn't a power play. This isn't a leverage move. This is just us. Can you handle that?" "I don't know," I admitted, trembling under her touch. "Figure it out," she whispered, leaning in to press a quick, hard kiss to my forehead, a seal of ownership. "Because I'm not letting you go." The boardroom at 10 a.m. was a surreal theater of the absurd. The same players were there. The blustering VP of sales, the nervous analysts, the partners checking their watches. But the play had changed completely. I sat in my usual spot in the back row, clutching my tablet like a shield. Ashley sat at the head of the table. She was back in the full armor, a charcoal suit, a crisp white shirt buttoned to the throat, the tortoiseshell glasses. She looked impenetrable. She looked like the weather system that had descended upon the firm months ago. I watched her dismantle the creative director's pitch with surgical precision. "The narrative lacks tension," she said, her voice cool, detached, and utterly terrifying. "It's too safe. The market doesn't reward safety. It rewards conviction." The room held its breath, terrified of her judgment. But I felt a smile threaten to break across my face, a dangerous secret blooming in my chest. I knew the woman who craved safety in the dark. I knew the woman who whispered that she was lonely at the altitude. I knew the sound she made when she lost control. It was a secret power, this knowledge. It was like carrying a loaded gun in my purse, a hidden weight that changed the gravity of the room. Then it happened. The subtle recognition. The VP made a comment about the Q1 targets being overly aggressive. Ashley paused. She tapped her silver pen against the mahogany table, the sound echoing in the silence. And for the briefest second, she looked past him. She looked directly at me, in the back corner. It wasn't the terrifying scrutiny of October. It wasn't the hungry desperation of last night. It was a wink without winking. It was a shared frequency. "Do you hear this?" her eyes said. "Are you with me?" I held her gaze. I didn't look away. "I'm here," I projected back. The fear evaporated. I realized then that the strategy hadn't been an excuse to get me into bed. It had been an interview for a partnership I hadn't known I was applying for. We weren't just lovers hiding in the supply closet. We were allies. We were a closed loop in a system designed to isolate us. Later, in the elevator, we found ourselves alone for 10 seconds, between the lobby and the 42nd floor. The doors slid shut, sealing us in the mirrored box. Ashley didn't move closer. The cameras were watching. But she shifted her stance, angling her body toward mine,
the air between us charging instantly. "Tonight," she said, staring straight ahead at the steel doors, her reflection calm but her eyes burning. "My place, not the office." "Is that a directive, Director?" I asked, suppressing a shiver. "It's a proposal," she murmured, the corner of her mouth twitching upward. "I need to align the strategy on domestic logistics." "I think I can clear my calendar," I replied. The doors opened. She walked out first, her stride confident, her heels clicking a rhythm of absolute control. I followed her, no longer invisible, no longer just a junior strategist. I was the only person who knew the map to the territory behind the wall. The lines didn't just blur, they vanished. We built a new world in the space between the boardroom and the bedroom, a secret architecture of glances and late-night confessions. The door to her office clicked shut behind me again, but this time I didn't hesitate. I locked it. If you know the tension of a silence that speaks louder than words, subscribe for the next chapter. Tell me in the comments, is it ever really just about work?